All right. Well, this begins an interview with Justice Gary Stein in Hackensack, New Jersey on April 6, 2017. My name is Sean Illingworth. I'm with the Rutgers Oral History Archive, and this is the first session for the New Jersey Supreme Court Oral History Program sponsored by the Administration of the Courts. And thank you very much for sitting down with us.
My pleasure, Sean. Glad to be doing it.
Thank you. To begin, can you tell me where and when you were born?
June 13, 1933, I was born in Beth Israel Hospital in Newark, New Jersey.
Okay. Now, what were your parents' names?
My mom was named Molly Goldfarb. Her maiden name was Goldfarb. My dad was Morris Stein. They were both children of Russian immigrants. My dad's parents, Nathan and Rachel, had 4 children. My dad was the oldest. My mom's parents, Bessie and Louis Goldfarb, I believe had 8 children, 2 of whom perhaps died either in childbirth or very young. My mom was, I think, the youngest in her family. Her parents owned a 6-family house in Newark at 540 South 17th Street, and she went to Central High School in Newark. My dad went to Southside High School. Dad had to leave high school in order to raise some money to help support the family. My mom finished Central High School. Neither of them went to college. That was not unusual for their generation. But it has always occurred to me over the years that their lives would have been different had they had the same opportunity they offered to me.
Do you know anything about how the families came to the U.S.? If it was just economic opportunity, or were they facing pogroms?
I don't know in detail, but they were part of the generation that left Russia. I think their homes were near the Polish border, but I don't know any of the details. My father's father, Nathan, was a paper hanger. He also wrote Yiddish poetry. Oh. And my mom's father, Louis, had a horse and cart and collected scrap in Newark and supported his family that way. And then with his savings bought this 6-family house on South 17th Street, which I think was their source of income. My mother's parents were Orthodox Jewish folks, and my dad's parents were not, although my grandfather Nathan was quite learned about the Jewish faith, but was not a regular temple goer. My mother's parents, however, did go to temple, observed all the high holy days, and one of my childhood memories is not only visiting them at the temple, which was something that was customary for kids to do with their grandparents in those days, but also because they were Orthodox and wouldn't drive or wouldn't go in a motor vehicle on Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah. I would walk home with them in every kind of weather. And I vividly remember the slow walk back from the temple on Avon Avenue, at least 1.5 miles, 2 miles to their home on the other side of Newark. But they were very observant, and it's sort of funny. Because they were so observant, my own parents were not at all observant. But my mom thought that out of respect for her parents, it was important for me to have a comprehensive Hebrew education. So from the age of 8, I attended a synagogue in Irvington where we lived. It was on the second floor over an auto body shop. It was Congregation Ahavath Achim Biker Cholim, and I went 5 days a week for 5 years out of respect for my grandparents. And in retrospect, I think I learned the same thing every year for 5 years, although I became a fairly proficient Hebrew reader. But I diligently attended for 5 years until my bar mitzvah at the age of 13, when I was cut loose and allowed to resume a regular life. But 5 days meant that after school, every weekday except Friday, I would go to Hebrew school classes for an hour, as well as on Sunday morning. The reward in those days were, if you were the fastest reader in the class, you would get from the rabbi a chit that would entitle you to an ice cream soda across the street at Katz's drugstore. And because I attended for so many years, I was the recipient of many free ice cream sodas during those years.
So when you were growing up, was the family already in Irvington?
We moved to Irvington in 1940. My earliest memory, I think my parents lived in East Orange when I was born, and I'm the oldest of two boys. My brother Robert, also a lawyer, is 12 years younger. I think his birthday's tomorrow. So my earliest memory was that I was living as a kid, maybe 3 years old, on the corner of Madison Avenue and 15th Street in Newark, in a little apartment behind a grocery store that my parents were running then. And I think I was there for perhaps 3 or 4 years, say from the age of 3, maybe till 5.5 or 6. And we had, I think, 2 rooms behind the grocery store. And I thought it was a great place to live, because whenever we sat down for dinner at night, if I needed to have a bottle of soda with my dinner, I was allowed to go into the grocery store and pluck a bottle of Hoffman soda from under the counter. And so we lived there until around 1939, when the grocery store went belly up. And my parents and I moved in with my mother's parents for a year and a half, and my dad embarked on a new career selling television sets. This was the eve of television as we know it today, and my vivid recollection is that he was selling large television sets to taverns in the Newark area. And one day I remember a big commotion in the kitchen of my grandparents' house, and apparently my father had successfully convinced 2 tavern owners to buy big television sets, and with the commission from that sale, that enabled us to leave my grandparents' home and to move to an apartment in Irvington at 7 Robert Place, which is where I lived from the age of 7 until I left in 1950 to attend Duke University. So I was there right through my grade school years, starting with 3rd grade, through grade school, and through Irvington High School.
Now, did you start going to school in Newark when you were living there?
Sure. I attended a grade school, I think on South 16th Street or South 18th Street, I'm not sure which, and I also had attended Madison Avenue School in Newark when we had the grocery store. So I did a little bit of public school in Newark on Madison Avenue, then a little bit, maybe a year or so, near my grandparents' house. And then when we moved to Irvington, I entered the 3rd grade in the Union Avenue School in Irvington and attended Union Avenue School right through to the 8th grade. Graduated and then went to Irvington High School. Irvington High School in those days was overcrowded, had a split schedule. Of course, it was a very different community than it is today. Today, Irvington's probably 85% black, maybe 14% Latino, with a smattering of Asian and white. Back in the days that I was there, from 1946 to 1950, it was all white. It was a middle income, lower income community, blue collar community. Not a great school system, but an adequate school system. And because it was overcrowded, it had a split schedule, which meant that 9th and 10th grades, I attended school from 1 o'clock to 5:30. 11th and 12th grades, I attended school from 8 to 12:30. The good part about that was I was able to have a part-time job to save some money for college. And for most of the 4 years in high school, I delivered prescriptions for a pharmacy in Hillside, which I got to on my bicycle from Irvington to Hillside. It was the Maple Pharmacy at the corner of Maple Avenue and Williamson Avenue. And it was no accident that they called the community in which that pharmacy was located Hillside, because it was built on the side of a hill, which meant that either way, either delivering the prescription or coming back, you were going uphill. And that was a very steep hill. But I enjoyed the work. I made 50 cents an hour, probably worked something like 25, 30 hours a week. So I made 12 to 15 bucks a week and faithfully saved the money so I could use it when I went to college.
So college was always your goal from early in your life?
Yeah, and it was just a wonderful motivation that my parents gave me. They realized what they had missed, and they very much wanted me to go to college. And so I always assumed that one way or the other I would get to college. I didn't know how I'd pay for it. But anyhow, when I went to begin looking at colleges to apply to, I applied to Rutgers in New Brunswick because I thought that would be the least expensive. I applied to the University of Pennsylvania. There was a fella in my high school, his name was Alan Max, and he was applying to Duke because his father, Charlie Max, had gone to Duke back in the 30s. So Alan said to me one day, "Why don't you apply to Duke?" And I said, "Where's that?" He told me, "It's in North Carolina, Durham." I said, "I can't afford to go to a school like that." He said, "No, you'd be surprised. Look at the catalog. The tuition is only $350 a year." So I looked at the catalog and I spoke to my parents, and they were not thrilled at the idea that I would go so far away. But they said, "If you want to apply, go ahead." So I did. But I never heard back. So one day I was walking on Webster Street where this friend Alan Max lived, and I saw his father Charlie on the front porch. And Charlie said to me, "Gary, are you going to go to Duke with my son Alan?" I said, "No, I'm not, Mr. Max. I'm going to go to Rutgers." I said, "I applied to Duke, but I never got a response." He said, "That's strange." He said, "Come on in the house with me." So I walked into his house, and he took me into his office, and he made a call, and he got a guy named Witherspoon on the phone. Turned out Witherspoon was the dean of admissions at Duke. And he and Charlie Max had been on the Duke boxing team together in the 30s, so they were buddies. So he asked Witherspoon about me. He said, "I got this smart kid here." He said, "He's smarter than my son Alan," but he said he never got an answer from his application. And so Witherspoon said something to him, and then Mr. Max asked me to step out of the room, which I did. And then when I came back in, he said, "You're probably going to hear from Duke in a couple of days." And I did. and I was accepted. And the explanation was that Duke had a Jewish quota in those days, probably something like 2%, and it must have been used up when they got my application. And so had it not been for Charlie Max, I would have gone to Rutgers and hopefully done just as well, but that intervention is what got me to Duke. And I told that story at the 60th law school reunion a year or so ago, when the first black man to attend Duke Law School told his story about how he got admitted to Duke, and I thought he would be interested in my story, so we exchanged stories about Duke's admission practices back in those days. Duke has come a long way since then.
Well, that was rather common in those days, the Jewish quota.
Sure.
Were you aware of that?
No.
No. Okay.
No.
All right.
No, nor was I aware that that Duke was segregated and Durham was segregated. And when I got to Durham in 1950, I was horrified to learn that blacks had a ride in the back of the bus, that they had separate bathrooms, separate water fountains, that black public school students were bused to black schools as a matter of North Carolina law. I simply had no idea until I got there that was the situation. Bothered me very much. I got into trouble many times by riding in the back of public buses going downtown to Durham and having bus drivers holler at me, but it just seemed like just a terrible practice, and I didn't like it.
I want to, before we talk more about Duke, I wanted to step back a bit. You grew up, you were born in the Great Depression, you moved to Irvington kind of at its height just before World War II, and then, of course, the war would have been a big part of your early teens, that period. Do you remember in any ways that those events impacted your family life, your life growing up?
Sure. I remember vividly walking up the street on Sunday, December 7th, and hearing people shout out their windows about the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor, and running home and listening to President Roosevelt on the radio. My recollection is vague, but there was rationing of gasoline, and I remember every family would have a specific letter coupon pasted on the back of their car, which indicated how much gasoline they were entitled to. My dad was a little too old to be drafted, but he was required to go to work in a defense factory, which was difficult for him. He was in his mid-30s at the time, and it was hard physical work. It's important to understand that back in those days, there were no fitness centers. People didn't jog or ride bikes outside. Adults didn't commonly engage in physical exercise, so that people lost their physical resilience at much younger ages than occurs today. So for my dad to go work in a factory was difficult, because he had been accustomed to being a salesman. I certainly remember various drives in support of the war effort. I remember the air raid drills that we would be required to participate in at grade school, which sometimes involved lying down under your desk in case a plane dropped a bomb. There was great awareness. The movies would always be preceded by a newsreel that showed the events of the Second World War. It was a very difficult time for the country, but there was tremendous cohesiveness in the country. That is, everybody was allied with the war effort. Everybody had family members somehow involved in the war. I had a couple of cousins who were in the military. And so it was, the 40s. Let's see, I was probably 12 when the war ended, around 7 or 8 when it started. But it was a very dramatic time to be a kid, and certainly it wasn't a time of great luxury or plenty. We were just a poor family struggling to get along like everybody else on the block was. Robert Place was a street with probably 12 or 15 four-family houses on each side of the street. So it was an enormous number of families lived on the block, loads of kids my age, older and younger. And it was a very typical blue-collar neighborhood in those days, and the war was a very powerful factor for all of us as kids. And of course, I have memories of my family gathering around the radio when President Roosevelt would deliver his fireside chats. It was a time when the country was unified. Certainly nothing like the political division we have today.
Well, I noticed on the wall in your office you have Roosevelt's picture. If I'm correct.
Sure.
Franklin, yeah.
Sure.
Oh,
Both
yeah,
Roosevelts.
both Roosevelts. Yeah.
Both Teddy and Franklin.
Yeah.
My late wife had found the picture. I think she found both of them. My late wife's name was E.T. Was not her given name, but she made me change it legally because she didn't like her given name. Her maiden name was Tilchin, and she loved antique stores, and so she picked out both of those photos on one of our trips. And during the last occasion when there was somebody that knew how to hang pictures in the office, I had both of them hung there. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask, how did your family feel about FDR?
They were devoted to him. It was characteristic of all of the members of my family, aunts and uncles, and the lower middle class children of immigrants, certainly the Jewish community that was growing up at that time and raising families, were absolutely devoted to President Roosevelt because he was instrumental in passing the Social Security law and other legislation that benefited working families. He was considered to be a friend of the working man, and there was great support and respect for him. My parents were not sophisticated observers of history, and certainly I wasn't at that stage in my life, so whatever mistakes he made, like the court packing plan and things like that, were not anything that I knew anything about. All I knew was that he was the president, and my parents thought he was great, and so did I.
After the family grocery store closed, did your mother work outside the home at all?
She did. She worked downtown Newark. My recollection is in her years right after high school, she worked for the Prudential Insurance Company, which was one of the big employers in Newark. She worked in retail for Bamberger's department store, which was part of the Macy's chain. And she worked for the Lerner shops, which is a dress shop still in existence. And so for most of the years that I was growing up, she was working in retail, stopped working when my brother was born in 1945. And then much later in life, after I graduated law school, she actually opened her own store in Newark, which was a half-size shop catering to women who wore larger size clothes. And she ran that store with a partner in Newark, then moved it to Milburn. and was modestly successful. I think that chapter of my parents' life was probably the easiest economically, because she was able to supplement my dad's income, and it enabled them to go on some vacations that were a little more upscale than they had experienced before. They went on a few cruises, and so that was a very nice evolution for my mom. Regrettably, my mom died of breast cancer at the age of 67. She died in 1976, so obviously she had to cut short her time with my 5 children, whom she loved dearly. But I would, on reflection, say this. She had an indomitable spirit. She was a wonderfully optimistic person, even though she and my dad went through some very tough years. And I've often thought that I was so fortunate, because I share her optimism, and I'm sure it was passed on to me from her. She was someone who always found the glass to be half full. We used to sing together on family road trips. She was easy to talk to, and I think she shared a lot of her innermost thoughts with me, because during the years my dad was in the retail business, there was a period in the 40s when he had his own retail store in Millburn selling appliances. And the 40s was not a good time to be in the appliance business, so that was a very difficult time for him. And I think as an older person, I can appreciate that he was probably frustrated, because he was a bright man, but untrained and unschooled. He was a championship chess player and checker player. And I can only infer from his ability in those activities that he had a fine mind, and if he had had the opportunity to be educated, his life would have been different. But he experienced a lot of economic frustration. His store in Millburn, which he owned for 4 years, he eventually had to sell in the mid-40s. And most of his business career he spent working as an employee for large retail appliance chains like Two Guys from Harrison and Jersey Tire. And those were tough jobs. They were 6 days a week, typically 9 to 6, if not longer. And so it was hard for him to come home cheerful. That was just a tough gig. And so I think the relationship I had with my mom was influenced by the fact that it was harder for her to talk at length with him about her feelings, because he had his own pile of frustrations with the work he was doing. And so I think my mom was a profound influence on me, especially urging me to do well in school and get an education. My father, on the other hand, was equally determined to see me educated, because he had a rule that he wouldn't affix the required parental signature on my report card if I had any grades other than A's. So my mother typically signed my report card, because it was a rare occasion when I'd come home with straight A's, although sometimes I did. I remember being rewarded at the age of 8 with bringing home a report card with straight A's, and winding up with the red Schwinn bicycle that I rode during the years at Irvington High School delivering prescriptions. But So both of my parents were determined to see me get the chance in life that they had missed, and I'm eternally grateful to both of them for that. And they did the same for my brother Robert, who went to Franklin and Marshall College and NYU Law School and had a wonderful career as an attorney, both in New York as a partner with a major law firm and more recently as general counsel to an Italian and Swiss steel company, where he commuted between Lugano, Switzerland, and New York City, where he lives. So they succeeded. They were successful in raising their two kids, making sure their kids got the education they were denied, and of course we in turn have done the same for our children. And behind me up there are my 16 grandchildren, all of whom are following the same path. So the American experience, which starts out for so many families with immigrants who come here forced to learn the language, forced to do menial work, raising families, and then seeing in a generation or two later the fruits of their labor. The American dream is alive and well, at least in the Stein family.